Hey, Sovereign Wealth Builders, Simon Dixon here, and welcome to another episode of Simon Dixon Hard Talk Live. We are on Iran War Week 7, and if it isn't crystal clear to you by now what this real war, what it was really about, and we've been covering it week by week, but it's reached the point where you can't really deny it. Of course, this wasn't about saving the Iranian people. This wasn't resistance. This was global energy, global rare earth minerals, and the real deal with China that's going to be announced most likely on May the 14th. And so we're going to break it all down today. We're going to recap what we've covered. And I'm going to share with you what I think the real deal is so that you can figure out how to protect yourself and not be fooled. The deaths were real. The negotiations were part of, the war was part of the negotiations. And the deal was always going to happen. So we're going to break it down. And part one, effectively, I'm going to be going through oil, chips, and the choke points that were actually negotiated and were part of the deal and what that actually means. Then in part two, we're going to get a bit more humane. Part one is going to be very analytical. In part two, I'm going to get a bit more humane, and we're going to be going through exit strategies, why I think Bitcoin is an important part of that. And I'm going to be doing that through an interview that I conducted by Natalie Brunel. And I share some stories that I've never shared before as well. So we're going to be covering that in part two. Right. Without further ado, let's go straight into the analysis. So part one, Iran War Week 7, the real war, oil, chips, and the choke points. So effectively, part 7 or week 7 is really where the narrative completely breaks down. All of the false narratives, all that this is about, everything that we were framed in the public and the media. Everybody at this point should know that it was all absolute lie and narrative around the real negotiations that were happening in the background, which is an exit of the forever war by the military industrial complex in the Middle East in recognition that China had already won the trade war and we needed a global energy reset in the middle so that the financial industrial complex, alongside transnational capital and sovereign wealth funds, could swoop in and rebuild all of the infrastructure, which moves America to shrink it into a regional power, while the Middle East effectively becomes West Asia and aligns with BRICS and the global South, and transnational capital and the financial industrial complex was negotiating what they get in return. So this is no longer about any Iran narrative. This is all around the system underneath the war and all of the different choke points. So we said that throughout. No need to apologize in the comments for all of the amount of abuse I had. I covered it in real time on Spaces, on X, and it was a rough ride. I do have to tell you, this is the one subject where no matter what you say, someone has a preconceived idea of how the world works, and you get abuse throughout the whole thing. I've always said I tried to separate my humanitarian hat, and these were crimes against humanity, and my analytical hat, where it doesn't matter what I want to happen. It doesn't matter what I think is happening. It doesn't matter what I feel, because what I feel ain't going to change anything, because it's the real leaders and real power. And your job is to understand what the real power is doing so that you can get ahead of it, because the media and the politicians are going to put you behind, stuck in a false narrative, believing that you can vote your way out of this. And this actually just is around Trump or a politician or Trump derangement syndrome or left or right. You got to suspend away from all of that. So what happened in week 1? Well, effectively, week 1 was the opening shock. And this was to send shock and waves around what the negotiation is. The negotiation had already happened prior to the war. And that was to de-radicalize certain aspects of the military-industrial complex apparatus. That consists of radical Zionists agitating narrative in order to escalate war around the region so that nobody could unify around their energy. The neocons in America, represented by Lindsey Graham as a cartoon character, that effectively push a narrative of the forever war, weapons of mass destruction, fake war on terror, communism versus capitalism, the neocon narrative. And then at the top of that, the resistance economy that was propped up by the hardliners in IRGC, which is represented by effectively pragmatic reality, which is represented by Iran-Contra affair, that I've covered in many, many times. We're not going to cover that again. Well, anyway, it set the stage that this is about protecting the Iranian people, that this is about the petrodollar, and America's going to take over Iran, and we're going to control the oil, and we're going to price it in dollars, and America is the falling global hegemon, and some crazy Trump is trying to hold on and make America great again, the Magatard narrative. That was all set the framework. In the background, this was all about the deals that were being negotiated with China, and the resetting of the world order, which is why Trump was installed in the first place. Originally, Department of Government Efficiency was a data collection exercise for AI and the technical industrial complex. Then he moved into tariffs, which was to reset the world, bankrupt American small business, concentrate power, bankrupt the small exporting companies, and push everyone towards China and BRICS as America becomes an unstable trading partner. Then it was about discrediting America through the Epstein files, and really, ruining in the minds of the illusion that was painted by revealing many of the operations. We had the deconstruction of USAID, the relationship with Israel, a narrative that Israel is kind of blackmailing, and therefore Israel rules the world, and us Americans, we'd never do this. The politicians would never do this. We have to be blackmailed in order to do this, which is military-industrial complex, and Israel is a proxy for military powers. Then finally, you needed the global reset, the energy reset that we covered. And that Trump has delivered, and that was all for compensating the military-industrial complex and transitioning to the financial-industrial complex model, by making them record profits, record assets under administration, setting the big print narrative, and also, sending throughout this whole thing, central banks were selling their treasuries for gold. And then we have the final squeeze, the asset stripping, the K-shaped economy, which is effectively where the entire West is asset stripped for the financial industrial complex. And then you usher in the police and surveillance state as a result of it, which the technical industrial complex has been building. So in week 2, we did the escalation phase. This is where they needed you to believe that we're going to have World War III, and there's going to be global famine and all the stuff from the different phases. And there's going to be all the things that we knew would happen if this was a long war. But throughout, I was covering the markets and saying, this is what happens if you allow the price of oil to go up, the bond yields to go up, and you continue this for a long term or escalate towards World War III. And we knew it wasn't going to happen because the escalation phase was setting up a set of parameters that just led to market manipulation, and bounded escalation is the word I'm looking for. So in week 3, I started talking about, right, we can now see what the settlement phase is. And then lo and behold, after that, we started to get the framework of a deal. Iran said, here's the 6 things that are important to us. America said, here's the 15 points. Iran then said, here's the 10 points. And we had the theater that followed, making people believe, and everyone was saying to me, no, they're not going to settle. There's no negotiations. Iran's going to rule the world, or America's ruling the world. And everyone had, their different narrative based upon their worldview. Then in week 4, I started to analyze the targets of what had been destroyed, the infrastructure that had been destroyed. It was all around pumping the price of oil for the global reset, and then renegotiating all of the defense contracts, infrastructure contracts, energy contracts, and everything that is laying the ground for the Build Back Better phase, where now we reset the order by who invests in rebuilding the infrastructure. And that was all predetermined with the financial industrial complex, transnational capital, China, BRICS, the Gulf Cooperation Council, and the different ASEAN blocks and corridors. So week 4 was about that. In week 5, we covered that the market is confirming that there is going to be the reset, the energy crisis, but it's bounded and controlled escalation by looking at the bond markets, the oil markets, and the stock markets, and the gold and commodity markets, and the Bitcoin markets. So we set the frame. I said if this was going to be World War III, gold and oil would be rising, and oil would be significantly higher. But every time the price of oil hit that key point, 1 month futures, $115, we got a new theater where Trump would pretend we're going to nuclear war, or then there would be this new Hollywood final act movie where Trump comes along and does a blockade of the Strait of Hormuz. Meanwhile, all the negotiated tracks were going through. And then in week 6, last week, I covered that, right, they now need to leave a negotiation chip on the table. So there was the escalation within Lebanon, and we had effectively the final act before the framework of probably a 30, 60, 90, 5-year, 10-year, 20-year plan, effectively, that resets the world order, and the framework of that plan where there is tiered release of finances based upon hitting strategic milestones, but they needed to leave things in the deal. What were the things that were left in the deal? The framework was who's going to control the Strait of Hormuz, and which was the financial industrial complex bargaining chip, and the military industrial complex bargaining chip was Lebanon and Hezbollah, and everything I covered last week. So week 6, I covered the final acts, and we went through Lebanon and the end game and what I thought it would actually lead to. Because in the end, the justification under the military industrial complex for Israel is the IRGC. If the IRGC is normalized with Saudi Arabia via China, then the need for Israel is only the proxies and the resistance. So you have an operation to maintain IRGC narrative, which was the regime change at the higher levels of the hardliners. Then you have an act that strategically weakens Israel, and puts them into their own regime change and political process with Netanyahu. And then you no longer need the resistance, and so there has to be their own plan that involves negotiating and integrating them into the local armies and the local political process. We saw with Hamas that happened. I said they'd accept the deals. People told me it will never happen. Then we ended up with, a 20-point plan and the border peace framework. Whoever invests, remember, people didn't invest. Trump said, here's $1 billion for every member of the border and peace. Those started to fail because the Gulf countries are going to be putting in the investment, but they held out investing until the terms of the settlement was agreed, because it is effectively a U.S. exit. Then Iran would blow up all the U.S. infrastructure. And then you would have strategic check-ins. People called them, we're going to have a meeting in Pakistan. That was a proxy for China. And then the Gulf countries bailed out Pakistan because it was running out of its dollar reserves. So UAE, which was strategically weakened, they called upon the debt of Pakistan when you're following the money. And then Saudi and Qatar paid it so that they don't go deep into China's plan. And so this was all the negotiated settlement, but resistance needs to be integrated so that Israel can be reformed and rebranded, and then you can end the military funding of Israel. And it started looking at its next phase, which is integration into BRICS via India, while the financial industrial complex vassalized UAE into this new axis, while we set up for the next strategic tension and the regional stability in the Middle East. which will now be West Asia effectively. So in week 7, most people throughout this whole thing, they were either calling me immoral, unethical, inhumane. And again, I kept saying I cover the humanitarian side, but I can't let that emotion take over my analytical side. Otherwise, we'd just be like everyone else that thinks this war is about something else. Because I know what the FIC is willing to do and the military and the MIC is willing to do. And I know what the TICS plan, the technical industrial complex, is. And so I don't consider humanitarian in their decision. I just consider it in my decision as a spiritual human. But anyway, I think it's clear right now that in week 7, we set the terms. It is the real war. And so what happened? Immediately today, just before this recording, the US announces that it is considering a $20 billion deal around highly enriched uranium for Iran in exchange for releasing locked funds that will be managed by an external mediator. I said it will be integrated into BRICS. This was all about money, so follow the money. And Iran will accept a deal because it was doing its own internal regime change in order to prevent World War III, in order to prevent nuclear war, in order to prevent external forces. It was regime survival, and that you will have a new form of the IRGC after this. But you need the IRGC to be preserved to not send Iran into civil unrest after its previous operations. So basically that came out that there will be a $20 billion asset release in exchange for Iran's uranium surpluses. Remember the ones that Trump said in the 12-day war, the B-2 bomber took out? And I said, no, it didn't, because you can see the nuclear Bitcoin mining, that went down, and when that went back up. And I said the 12-day war was complete theater. And then I said, we'll go into another war, but it will be a transitionary war. Now, I didn't predict how big and how far this one would be. They did about 2 years in 1 year, in 4 to 5, 7 weeks. What are we on? Week 8. We may need another escalate to de-escalate, but nothing stops this train in terms of where it goes. And then people were trying to call me out. You didn't get this detail right on this day. I said, nothing stops this train. Directionally, this is where we're headed. And they're going to be checking in strategically and calling it negotiations while people pretend they're not negotiating. So talks have effectively exposed the strategy. And I hope people can see what this actually is right now. And then we know how the world works. And that's why I went into such detail every single week, so that you can understand how to follow the money. And then you can start falling for the traditional narrative. And so Iran listed an effectively a response to confirm it as well. So it's not just PR that someone's announcing, Trump. But what did they announce anyway? Iran official response. Let me read it. Quote, the Strait of Hormuz for all commercial vessels for the remaining period of the ceasefire. And so that's what has been confirmed in terms of the language. So here's the actual statement. In line with the ceasefire in Lebanon, remember Lebanon was the chip for the final negotiations, the passage for all, which is the military industrial complex negotiation, the passage for all commercial vessels through Strait of Hormuz is declared completely open for the remaining period of ceasefire. So there's bounded escalation. This will fix the markets. And then we enter into what will be a longer term framework, with milestones most likely. Now, there may be, there's a faction of IRGC that breaks the ceasefire, and therefore we need to do internal regime change and go to another bound of escalation to de-escalate. But this will be effectively either now or next round. I think it's more likely to be now, but we'll see. I'm not sat at these tables. I'm just following markets and understanding, the way that these different things work. So it'll be a period of ceasefire. So they leave it open in case they can't get there and they need additional leverage. On the coordinated routes, as already announced by ports and marine organizations in the Islamic Republic of Iran. Here's the important part. This is showing that the Iranian government, with the person that I said throughout this whole thing, had been groomed to be the new leader of the IR, in terms of the IRGC, underneath the Khamenei being replaced by Khamenei reformed supreme leader to continue the work of this managed transition, was Arachi. And Arachi is being groomed. And in the case of the US, J.D. Vance, in order to take credit, because J.D. Vance is Palantir's guy for the police and surveillance state in US. But anyway, this shows that the government has agency. And then if the IRGC doesn't escalate during these negotiations, then the IRGC is on board. And then finally, the supreme leader will sign off on it. And then everyone will start to see what this really was. And it is going to be regional stability that changes the Middle East into West Asia. And it wasn't Trump playing 5G chess. He's an agent of the financial industrial complex, while China set the plan via BRICS and aligning with GCC, and that the normalization agreement between Iran and Saudi Arabia. So no need to apologize. It's okay. I just wanted to have this a learning experience and maybe be humble. When I get things wrong, I'll say what I got wrong, and then I'll analyze why I got it wrong, and then what it actually means in terms of that's what we're doing. We're humans here. I can't figure everything out, but directionally, I think I've been more accurate than most. And maybe put in the comments if you agree with that, or if you still think I'm an idiot, and maybe you're still holding on to some narrative that it's not money that rules the world, and maybe this is some ideological thing. Right, let's go through it anyway. I got a lot of abuse, as I said, so I don't want to be. I'm really not trying to brag. I just only care about accuracy. I don't care about popularity. The things that I say are very unpopular with many people, but all I care is about being accurate, because then I know that the framework I'm sharing with you is likely to be more right than wrong. And therefore we can prepare so that you can get yourself ahead of this, because I want more and more people prepared for what comes next, because this is the biggest change we will ever experience in our lifetime, and it impacts everybody around the world. But I also want to reiterate, because people get confused by this, when I say theater, the deaths were real. The military industrial complex is more than happy for resources to kill millions of people. There's nothing new here. You're just seeing it in real time because we have access to new information and we can broad. But the deaths were real. The negotiations started before the war, and there were check-ins periodically. And I believe everything that happened throughout the war was negotiated in the factions of power that are aligned with the financial industrial complex, the Iranian reformist side, the less hardliner IRGC, the GCC as well as China BRICS. But then there were bounded escalation in order to find out who's not on board with the plan. And that's been going on for years, including October the 7th, including the Hezbollah pager attack, including the assassination of Qasem Soleimani in Trump 1. So you may think that this is some kind of traitor. This has been the movement of policy, and theater was the only way to execute it without ending up in civil unrest, creating a vacuum like in Syria, like in Iraq. The war was theater and actually part of the negotiations, as I said. So this was never about helping the Iranian people. Get smarter now. For those that were pushing those narratives, it's never about that. America has consistently, when it was the hegemon, installed dictators and pretended it was about protecting people. It's always been about resources, choke points, the dollar. And it's always been about rolling over the debt-based Ponzi scheme and dumping the debt on the American people and using markets in order to concentrate wealth through assets in fewer and fewer hands, and then taking everyone's pensions and debt and everything, turning it into a large asset management industry until BlackRock, State Street, and Vanguard and Aladdin's technology is managing trillions and trillions of dollars of assets, and is global in nature with no nationalistic vision. And therefore, it just sees countries as resources to extract through asset accumulation. So this was a financial industrial complex operation negotiated with compensation for the military industrial complex, which means you need to give them a new war playground. Why do you think Germany is building a military industrial complex on all their companies? And we're starting to see more and more of it in the US, because there's going to be internal civil unrest in America, escalation along the Putin narrative. There was a regime change in Hungary in order to unblock the unanimity so that you can unlock the Ukrainian money and invest it in the new military infrastructure that's being built in Germany, so that you can break, so that you can effectively diversify away from America and allocate capitals into these competing militaries, because America, will only be that regional power, and they'll asset strip it while birth rates go down, and then they don't have any immigration. And so therefore you're going to have an aging population, and those demographics in China and America and Europe, and countries with the decline in birth rates. And so they reallocate capital towards the countries with the birth rates. Okay. So, as I said, I don't think so, but we may need another round of escalation where the talks break down. Maybe someone breaks a ceasefire, a new theater, a narrative, but it will always be bounded, and then it will get back to the deal based upon this. Nothing stops this train in terms of the powers. So we have followed the money throughout. And what I'd like to do is, before we go into the deep analysis of what happened this week and what it means for you and what is the real future, so that you can prepare yourself, and all done by following the money as we do each and every week, let's take a little bit of break by playing some of the brilliant Iranian propaganda and these AI summary videos that I'm going to play throughout to just break it up a little bit. And I'll be back right after that video.
Yeah, I've never been friends with Epstein, but the pictures tell a different story. Epstein queen, kissing on the lips, living that scene. She says, never friends with a straight face lie, but the files got trumped by the balls. That's why she was smiling near the ear, hand on his chest, kissing Epstein deep, while the cameras click the rest. Now she's on TV saying we were never close, but the photos got her looking like the perfect host. Epstein wasn't just a friend, he was the key, held the dirt on Trump that nobody else could see. Every wild party, every private flight, now Netanyahu owns the White House day and night. Epstein queen, kissing on the lips, living that scene. She says, never friends with a straight face lie, but the files got trumped by the balls. That's why Netanyahu got the tapes, got the photos, got the proof. Now he pulls the strings and Trump jumps through the roof. Told him bomb Iran, start the war, light the fuse. Trump said yes sir, no way he could refuse. Because of Melania's nights with the devil in the dark, we're stuck in this war, watching missiles fly apart. She played the perfect wife while the blackmail ran deep. Now Iran pays the price for secrets that she keeps, sacred defense. Epstein queen, Netanyahu's dream. Trump can't say no, we see the strings, yeah.
Okay, hope you enjoyed that. Look, to recap, to add to the case, when I'm following the money, I ask myself real questions. If this was a real war, then why is the US creating a jet fuel shortage in the US and EU? Because while there is a narrative that America's going to be fine and they're not going to run out of oil, they are going to run out of jet fuel. And what is the consequences of that? Obviously, all Americans are going to be paying more for energy, and there is going to be a global reset type of lockdown style event that is going to be weaponizing this in order to move to that police and surveillance state. That's why you get these weaponization of these crisis events. And so if America is going to be fine, what does that actually mean? Well, it means a few companies that contribute to 1% of GDP in America are going to be fine, while 60% of Americans that make up the consumption of GDP are going to be impacted. And so that leads to massive pumps in market while the economy gets worse, and it gets worse for the American people. That's the K-shaped economy, the asset stripping exercise. So we will experience jet fuel shortages in the US, across the EU, as a result of this, and everywhere across Asia as well. Now, the dollar is propped up by those flows, the petrodollar, the euro dollar, and the Japan carry trade, and also the chips. So when you look through all the supply chains, you realize what's actually happening here. So let's ask some more questions. Why is Iran paying why is India paying in yuan via a bank in Dubai, UAE, that is effectively, signed off by Trump to make payment and settlements to Iran? Those types of flows, when you follow the money, you can see through the narrative. We were led to believe that UAE and Iran are about to go to war with each other, and that America was trying to choke off the strategic points. And why was shipments going throughout this whole time to China? Now, one could say Iran and China had the agreement, which is true to a certain degree. But if they really wanted to stop these, we're talking about World War II, oil blockade that led to Pearl Harbor and all that type of stuff. If they really wanted to do this, you would cut off all the trade as well. So why is UAE still the second largest trading partner of Iran after China? And why are Chinese ships still moving through the Hormuz throughout this whole thing? Covered that one. Why does the US rely upon China for the manufacturing of its US military industrial complex while it is draining all of its munitions? Why does America import its uranium from Russia? And why is Russia about to sign a deal as well as probably part of this settlement, when allegedly we're in a war between Iran and Ukraine? Well, anyone that's followed my shows over the years will know the answer to all these questions. Why trigger inflation? When effectively, remember what Trump's goal was? He said, in order to combat inflation, he's got to get the price of energy down. Why are we creating an event that systemically makes energy more expensive? And when the economy is consumption-led, why would you choose inflation over the profits of a few oil companies? That is a small contributor to that. These contradictions only make sense if this is not a war of nations. Everyone's trying to say they're trying to choke off China. They're saying that America's going to be doing great and America's going to... Once you realize that our governments have been captured by private corporate interest that is global in nature, everything makes sense. Israel's actions make sense, the GCC. So once you realize that, if you can get that our governments are completely captured and that our politicians just for rent and that the militaries are just militias for corporate resource extraction, then you realize that this is just a restructuring of systems in favor of the financial industrial complex, military industrial complex, and technical industrial complex that have to adjust to this new reality of multipolarity, and that there is no nationalistic agenda here. So the real war, as I've always covered, was actually, to do with, the real battlefield effectively was US private energy, Russian and Iranian state energy, and Gulf sovereign wealth backed by energy, and China with their rare earths and their manufacturing base and their monopoly on rare earths. And the whole world's dependence from the energy companies on China purchasing that oil to build the manufacturing base, which requires rare earths as the vital components. And that energy powers hardware, and that hardware powers, semiconductor chips and data centers, which is artificial intelligence and then the hardware behind robotics. So this was all about the new energy, which is semiconductor chips, and the ecosystem around it as we transition to this police and surveillance state world of AI, central bank digital currencies, stable coins, and how we resist back with Bitcoin and then the physical with gold. So this is basically energy versus materials versus chips. And that is the real war. Now you have to frame that not from the perspective of my country. There's only one country where the government actually is not captured by transnational capital. And that is the one that has a privatized state banking system, and all of its resources and companies are subordinate to the government, which is China, which is why it's so authoritarian, because the government actually is in charge. Corporate China, the Chinese deep state, the central banking system, the Chinese financial industrial complex, the Chinese military industrial complex, the Chinese technical industrial complex are all subordinate to the government. The rest of the world thinks that the government is a problem, but the government is just a battering ram for narrative to distract you from real power, and a piggy bank for wealth extraction from the people over to the corporate interest. And that's why the asset owners win. And those that are close to the central bank that can create the money and the 0% interest are the ones that get on the right side of this. And our job has always been making sure that you're on the right side, because it's always going to be a minority, structurally, mathematically, inevitable, predictable, guaranteed, just how the proof of weapons network and the financial industrial complex was structured. So once you've got that in mind, let's watch a little bit of an AI video, and then we'll come back and analyze the two offers and what it actually means.
Keep that same energy. You ain't nothing but a fraud. Yo, call him what he is. Liar! Yeah. Hey, loser, come closer. I'm the exposer. Fake billionaire, your whole empire opposer. You step down, another liar takes the crown. The whole system is a circus. You're just a clown. You drop fake news, sitting high in your tower, morally bankrupt, just drunk on the power. You're fired. Played your last trump card. No more aces, boy, you're discarded. Look in the mirror, tell me what you see. Big ego crushed, fake reality. We carve it in stone, we spell it in the fire. Ready for the truth, call him the liar. Labor of blood on your pride. Island Epstein, secrets you hide. All your crimes buried deep inside. Rotten systems, you're gonna slide. L-I-A-R. Yeah, we see you. L-I-A-R. We don't wipe us off the socials, yeah, you're hiding in fear, trying to silence every voice you don't wanna hear. From the MJ to Diana, yeah, we see how it goes. The system buries light, but the shadow always shows. Illuminati pots blood in the perjury. You lie, but the mission, it's Epstein fury. Yeah, round fool, yeah, the records are proof. Now we expose it all, this is April truth. Look in the mirror, tell me what you see. Big ego crushed, fake reality. We carve it in stone, we spell it in the fire. Ready for the truth, call him the liar. Labor of blood on your pride. All your crimes buried deep inside. Rotten systems, you're gonna slide. Hide. L-I-A-R. Yeah, we see you. L-I-A-R. We don't believe you. L-I-A-R. 13%, that's a failing grade. The world is watching, 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 watching. Liar!
Okay, so effectively in week 7, we kind of got to this final point where America got its final Hollywood movie. It got to say, we did a blockade for the magatards and the Q-tards. And then the narrative was set that America, which doesn't have a sovereign wealth fund, is going to be the winner because we've got all the energy. When most people can't realize that that's just a few companies that is going to cause massive inflation, massive poverty, and massive financial stress, and a massive debt burden that's going to need a big print, and the global reset and the implications on all the partners. Because people can't put that together, you get some people that just think this is going to be great for America, and therefore Trump is doing it for America when he's doing it for the financial industrial complex. But anyway, the game was set up after the blockade that effectively you had a blockade on a blockade. So you had on one side that Iran was enforcing the closure of the Strait of Hormuz. Then that led to Lloyd's of London and the insurance companies not insuring any of the shipments. And then we had what was the theatrical US blockade, where there was a threat that US would shoot you down if you don't have permission. So effectively, in order to get a shipment through, you needed the US, you needed Lloyd's of London, the financial industrial complex, and you needed Iran IRGC. So in order to get any shipments through, i.e. China, by the end of it, you needed cooperation from all three. And that's the theatrical element. There were deals that were done. You know, India got some through. You could directly negotiate with Iran, even though we're told that India and Israel were doing deals together. You know, but you can then get, you can then get the insurance through via Lloyd's of London. And you can also get US, which is effectively, let's call it BlackRock, as the most important player. And so that's how you got shipments through in the end. But the game was set up where effectively the US put out a bunch of, we said, right, we're going to enforce the blockade. Iran, you can't get any oil. And then everyone started to realize, oh, right, this is kind of about China and oil, and it wasn't about the Iranian people. But they were still getting it wrong. They thought that America was blockading China because America is not corporate captured and not run by transnational capital. And so everyone started to create their content around 5D chess, Trump playing chess, and how they're going to choke off China. And effectively, the narrative was Iran won't be able to export its oil to China. China effectively purchases 90% of oil from Iran. 98 of Iranian oil that is sold, 98% is sold to China. China gets it from everywhere, is well diversified. But what effectively happened leading up to this? Well, we had the long-term negotiation, right? Where Iran, Russia, and China did nothing for the Venezuela operation. And Venezuela clearly cooperated, whether it be at the Maduro level, we covered this previously, or further down. But clearly that was allowed to happen. So the Western Hemisphere, the Northern Hemisphere, is locked in on the American as a regional power. We continue to vassalize Europe, and Europe starts building its own military-industrial complex, has an energy crisis because it's cut off from Russia. And that lays the foundation for Russia and the military-industrial complex continuing to build the war economy. At the expense of the Europeans, they'll pay for it. And now you can have that side on the European side that vassalizes it into transnational capital and the financial industrial complex, the FIC. It gives compensation to the MIC, and Russia effectively gets Ukraine in cooperation with BlackRock at the end of that based upon years and years of probably continuing. You get the NATO reform at the same time. Now, China sets up an environment where there's an energy crisis for Taiwan and their semiconductor chips. Now, both China and America are dependent upon Taiwan. So the narrative is set up that we're going to World War III and that China's going to invade Taiwan now as a result of America cutting off the oil from Iran. Therefore, we're going to enter into World War III, and then Israel's going to enact the Samson option, and we're going to end up in nukes. That's how people were thinking this goes, and Trump has lost his mind and that type of stuff. But that was the game that was effectively set up. But through this energy crisis, Taiwan diplomatically can be bailed out by China and its vast oil reserves and energy reserves. And that can lead to a diplomatic solution that America doesn't need to defend. But an agreement needs to be signed around energy, currency, and semiconductor chips between the real powers, China and the financial industrial complex. Those are the two powers that are negotiating. Trump is a proxy for FIC. And then Mick needs compensating, so FIC can compensate Mick by giving him a new war zone. And the Gulf countries, which are part of transnational capital, they need to take a hit in order to build back better, aligned with eastwards rather than westwards, and you exit US with an acceptable narrative. And so the narrative was built that US has put an offer, you can buy oil from us. We're going to blockade Iranian oil. That sets the framework, we'll give them sanction relief, so that unlocks the flow for the eventual deal. We'll destroy infrastructure so that needs to be rebuilt with China. And then we'll plug them in so that they're aligned with the Gulf countries as well. And all of that infrastructure and defense contracts we need to be rebuilt. America gets compensated by, and Trump gets compensated by effectively selling lots of oil at very, very high prices and selling lots of LNG that's going to power a lot of this. Now, what do you really need to happen? Well, America is looting world reserve currency. So the war strengthened the currency, but Chinese yuan was outpacing it. Now you need to get back to where you were before the war, which is asset stripping US, fiscal dominance, big print, the US dollar underperforming foreign major currencies, the US stock market doing well, but underperforming capital outflows, and strategically weakening the dollar so that the rich get richer and the poor get poorer. And then dumping all the final debt and managing, repositioning all the capital outflows. That happened as soon as this was announced. We returned to all of those trends, the DXY, and then you get an announcement right before this from former US Treasury Secretary Hank Paulson, former Fed, saying that America is in a debt crisis and you need to prepare for a lack of demand for bonds. So the whole framework was completely set up. And then you get the kind of like COVID level, there's going to be food insecurity, which in certain regions there was. This is real. Like the theater they set up is still real. And we're going to have lockdowns from energy as we get through all of these supply chains that break and everything we need to get through in this new order. And big oil make a lot of money for the FIC. The second thing that happened is that Russia basically said, we can replace it. And so China has two options. It can go to Russia and replace it, or it can do a deal with America. Now, what happens if you do a deal with America where you strengthen the yuan and you weaken the dollar, which means America gives up world reserve currency for multipolarity, and that leads to capital outflows that breaks the petrodollar slowly in a managed way, breaks the Japan carry trade, who has a crisis because of the energy and needs to increase those rates, and the relationship with the euro dollar. You get a new military industrial complex in Europe based upon the Russia escalation. Meanwhile, Iran has record levels of sales from its oil and energy. And it also had a hedge anyway, where it was like burning oil to turn to electricity and going through its alternative routes. as well as the Hormuz being open to China, obviously, because China was preparing for a decade leading up to this, with all of its alternative energy and the largest oil reserves in the world as well as all the other types of components and rare earths and everything else, 50 different components. And so Russia said that it can replace it. And so effectively, all of those contracts were force majeured. Qatar had to do it, but it was hedged. Remember, Cheniere Energy, Golden Pass, Chevron, Exxon did incredibly well in US. But who's the Golden Pass owned by? 70% owned by Qatar and 30% owned by Exxon. And so that's their compensation. Saudi had the alternative pipelines. The price of oil goes up, you have demand destruction. And at $140 per barrel, you're able to meet all the demand. So this is very carefully orchestrated FIC operation. We had all the market manipulation. And throughout all of this, I said, here's the level of oil. Here's the 10-year treasury. Here's the 30-year treasury where you get a change in narrative. So anyway, both US private corporate interest and Russian and Iranian, they needed to make up for 1.4 barrels per day. That's the reality. Russia, effectively, it went to full capacity. So it fulfilled what it could, and obviously it needs to hold it for its own, but it solved as many issues as it came, which comes with terms and conditions always, aligning it into bricks. And US blocked its, basically, blocks were very selective. So these were all renegotiations of oil contracts for the major energy exporters. You know, China is still getting its energy that it needs and its oil and has its reserves and can ride it out for a long time. China already has the allegedly $1.4 billion barrels in reserves. That's the disclosed ones that everybody knows about. And we entered into effectively the choke point war. And these two choke points that ended up in the final acts were the Strait of Hormuz, which is effectively energy and all of the petrochemicals that made up fertilizers that leads to the insecurity, as well as the helium and the other types of semiconductor chips that lead to the need for South Korea and Taiwan and their semiconductor manufacturing, as well as impacting the jet industry in America and globally, and the trucking industry with diesel in America and globally. Those were manufactured shortages as a result of that. So you have trucking, you have flights, you have semiconductor chips, and you have energy. That's the financial industrial complex and technical industrial complex renegotiation. Then on the China side, you have all the components that are needed, rare earths, which are needed for all the different things that make up the MIC, the TIC, and the FIC. But both lead to, effectively, oil, power, petrochemicals, and the processing side on one side of the negotiation. And then on the other side, you have the rare earth minerals, which is the artificial intelligence, the defense contracts, magnets, electric vehicles. And if China and America are genuinely at war, none of that works. And we saw that during the tariff, which is why tariffs were a way of resetting the order by the fact that China had already won the trade war, because it had secured its energy, it had secured its Belt and Road Initiative, it had secured its demand globally, it had built the manufacturing base, it privatized its state banking system so it wasn't under control. It had capital controls, and it built out all of the alternative energy and everything that was needed, because China's able to think long term, whereas America and the West are controlled by FIC, and that is short term. It's infinite thinking in game theory versus finite thinking with a deadline. So anyway, you had two supply chains, one endpoint, and everything leading to artificial intelligence, which brings us to the Taiwan. Now, Taiwan is effectively the real center. South Korea, Taiwan, Netherlands are the supply chains for semiconductor chips, which power everything. And you can't blockade it, you can't break it, you can only create a bottleneck that leads to a renegotiation. And all of it needs energy and rare earth minerals to function. So no one wants a real war, which is what I said around, the whole thing. And people were like, no, 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 they're trying to create war and get Taiwan to invade and enter into World War III and enter into nukes. That's mutually assured destruction economically, financially, and humanity and militarily and everything. So the only leverage is really what I was saying all along. It was China's strategy, which was regional stability in the Middle East. And the whole thing that we've been witnessing is China's strategy, both from Trump's side, both from Iran's side, both from the GCC side, and the FIC side, the MIC side, the TIC side. This was a high-level power dynamics negotiation. And when you don't understand who's in power and who controls who, it just looks crazy and chaotic and leads you to the wrong conclusion. So let's analyze the strategy. Let's review what happens next, and we'll make sure you can protect yourself. We'll take a little bit of a break with an AI video right now.
Our inbox is flooded with Americans saying they don't watch the news. They listen to our songs instead, since your media is full of shit. Let's keep it 100 and talk reality. 5,000 years of Persian soul, of poetry and light. You sold nuclear threat to every camera in sight, but our leader said nukes are haram on record clear. The real atomic arsenal, Tel Aviv, my dear. The IAEA in the building, they've been watching the file. Israel's undeclared warhead stacked up mile by mile. You weaponized the fear of Iran to fund the machine, while AIPAC lobbied Congress and pocketed your team. While soldiers bleed for Bibi's dream. Your son-in-law cashed $2 billion from the Saudi regime, Kushner. Your lobby chain is tight as choking out the globe, while your son is trading stocks inside his velvet robe. Baron. Wake up, America, open your eyes to the devil's design. Epstein, pedophile ruler, sacrificing for Israel's line. Wake up, America, open your eyes to the devil's design. The world's watching your move. Feed the swine. Epstein's Island, 40 plus flights on the log. You the main character, Jeffrey was just a prologue. You act like a savior, but you're leaving bodies cold. How many nations have you broken? How many lies have you sold? Vietnam, Japan, Korea, Iraq, Afghanistan, Libya, Panama, Syria, Germany, Serbia, Indonesia, Cuba, Sudan, Pakistan, Egypt, Jordan, Palestine, Lebanon, Yemen. We're bringing you freedom, bro. They never asked for that. Retribution is coming with a storm you can't tame. Iran doesn't forget, and we're coming for the game. Spoiler alert, Israel's final war? It's against y'all. Take it seriously. Before it's too late, they're just using you for now. Wanna see the real truth? Watch how they talk on Jesus. Don't say I didn't warn you. Wake up, America.
Okay, so let's look at the China side of the deal. So look, there is a narrative that Trump was trying to prop up the petrodollar, take over Iran, do a ground invasion, take over the oil, price it all in dollars, and dominate the world. And China's going to be collapsed, and Trump is working for the American people to make America great again. Now let's get back to reality. So China's not collapsing. China has a privatized a state-controlled banking system by PBOC. It created alternative payment rails, SIPs, that was integrated with 110 different alternative payment rails. The Enbridge project, which is now being hosted in across UAE and Saudi, is the network of central bank digital currencies that effectively disrupts SWIFT. And the whole payment system of de-dollarization didn't fall for the European psyop of creating a single BRICS currency, which was an operation to try and make that happen. But China has that privatized banking system. Now, it doesn't want to be world reserve currency. This is multipolar currencies. This is where you can continue to have the dollar as the mechanism for pricing, but you settle in alternative currencies. And you have mechanisms for instant transactions, which is the whole blockchain CBDC stablecoin network. But they effectively have a demographic issue. And that demographic issue is an aging population that may lead over the decades ahead to a reduction in the population by 250 million. And you've got low birth rates. And so what are you going to do? That is the same in America and across Europe as well with these birth rates. And that's why immigration was an attempt by the FIC to solve that. But when it didn't work, and we had this sheer acceleration of wealth transfer with the K-shaped economy, instead they used it as a civil unrest campaign to create strategic tensions for the police and surveillance state. And that's why you had that whole open border, closed border narrative with Biden. You know, this is uni-party policy. And then Palantir solves it with the border control, which was beta tested across the Palestinian laboratory and various other things. But effectively, China has all the exporting supply chains because it joined the World Trade Organization, and through globalization, everybody did their manufacturing in China. Companies like Apple and Tesla, they had an agreement with the CCP where they could build their factories cheaply as long as the workers were able to work for other Chinese companies and use a lot of the processes that Apple was using in China and Tesla were using in China. And then they started to obviously build their own capacity and accelerate in terms of their technology and in the AI race and everything else. But anyway, effectively, China, in order to deal with this demographic issue, it started selling its US treasuries and purchasing both gold, and rather than lending it to the US government in US treasuries, it would invest in its Belt and Road Initiative. And that was to push up the supply chain effectively, rather than do what the IMF did, which is you destroy currencies, you launch covert wars, you install a puppet government, and then you extract all of the resources for the American economy and to prop up the dollar and roll over the Ponzi scheme. It simply invested with the countries that wanted to build up their supply chains. And so because China has a decline in population, you can effectively build factories it started building in Mexico, in various other places. But it started deploying $1.4 billion of cash in its Belt and Road Initiative to build up alternative infrastructure. Now, if you were a bad negotiator, then you would get a bad deal. But if you made conditions that you have to build your factories here, and we want to control part of the supply chain, then China just negotiated from the position of the global South and Africa deciding what was acceptable. And so a bunch of deals were negotiated that led to the control of various ports, tolls, all sorts of stuff, the deconstruction of the Bretton Woods system. And they were effectively embedding global infrastructure, which meant everyone would rather work with China than the IMF because you got to actually build. They would have jobs there. They actually got to control more of the supply chain. Now they would have to tie it back to purchasing from China, and there would be an element of exploitation. China thinks about China first, of course. But it gave an alternative and significantly better to the predatory rape, pillage, and death and destruction of the IMF and propping up the dollar. And so China basically has built this global infrastructure and basically reorganized it so that it had its manufacturing bases by partnering with countries in Africa and where the birth rates were. Where were the birth rates? Africa and Southeast Asia. And so they started exporting global demand, but this created a risk, which is exports are cheaper if you weaken your currency. But they decided that when America is financializing and the K-shaped economy creates civil unrest, because the rich get richer, the poor get poorer continually, and it hollows out the manufacturing base, it was effectively creating extreme polarization, and then external parties would lead to war, and then the MIC would profit from that. And you had this issue that where effectively America became extremely financialized and securitized. And the stronger the dollar was, the more people would lend back, purchase up treasuries, prop up the debt-based Ponzi scheme. Now, tariff policies effectively reverse that. And de-dollarization through the Russia, sanctions and various other things reverse that. And when America, through Trump administration 1, became an energy exporter, That reversed that as well, because now they were competing with the Gulf countries and the petrodollar. So the aging population means you have less consumption. So I think their solution was to build a global consumption base, but also utilize and deploy artificial intelligence and robotics internally, and have a central bank digital currency, universal basic income, in an environment where most people have savings and most people own their real estate. And so where did they start investing? As I said, Southeast Asia, Africa, and the Middle East. And so who is the most important relationship for the Middle East? Well, it used to be America, but now it's China. All of those sovereign wealth funds across all the different Gulf countries. And you started to see that. UAE during this signed 25 different trade deals with China, even though the narrative is that it's leaning into Israel. It will be acquiring a lot of Israeli assets, and there will be obviously BRICS strategic tension, and the financial industrial complex will weaken it in order to acquire it and use it as a gold transfer mechanism. But who's buying the gold? China's buying the gold, you know. So you can see how the Middle East is becoming West Asia. So this means that it doesn't really need domestic demand, but it means that your currency is always weakened. That created this tension between China and US. And so when China starts selling off its treasuries, and it had about 1.3 trillion, and I think it's now down to about 650 billion, that creates selling pressure on treasuries, which pushes up yields in America. So the yield on the 10-year and 30-year treasury, which pushes up mortgages. And so if everyone's in debt and credit card interest is going up, mortgage interest is going up, and the entire American economy is effectively in record levels of debt, consumer, corporate, and government, then that higher debt creates a doom loop and a crisis, a treasury market price crisis. But the FIC has always used treasuries as their reserve asset and the central banks. So you had that massive selling and purchasing of gold as everyone started to hedge into this. And you had a strategy of exiting slowly, but without destroying the dollar, in partnership with transnational capital. And so then China and the Gulf countries were able to, the Gulf started buying equity, all of the AI equity, the stock market started booming like crazy, but the treasury markets had severe stress. And that's the backbone of the financial industrial complex. So they started investing in alternative MIC, FIC, and TIC infrastructures globally, asset stripping America and building it globally via these negotiations. And so everything, when the China was selling its $1.4 billion of treasuries, it moved it into gold, and it also moved it into infrastructure, and it started purchasing energy ready for this. So it had all the energy, all the infrastructure, and it had a long-term strategy, which it executed to perfection. It also started building all the yuan settlement layers integrated in order to compete with SWIFT. Now, it had capital controls. It doesn't want everyone to start lending like the US model, because this is a model of multipolarity. It wants to control its currency. It doesn't want a FIC takeover, which is why it keeps PBOC, the central bank, nationalized. And effectively, it started converting currency into, or its treasuries into power, rather than propping up the US debt-based Ponzi scheme. Gold was always the signal. When it went to a high of $5,500, it had a rebound. That trend continues, certainly in multipolarity. And so when this war today, we've gone up to about 4,800, a correction, a slow burn. Bitcoin started, throughout the war, started strengthening. And then after the war has continued to strengthen as well into the settlement layer. Central banks were buying gold like crazy because they don't want any counterparty risk in this transition. And they don't want sanction risk, because there were more and more weaponization of tariffs. So by pushing central banks into gold, sanctions became less powerful. And by doing tariffs, now you got everyone to renegotiate with alternative partners, regional partnerships, regional blocks, China partnerships, BRICS, GCC, ASEAN, SCO. Now, the European Union obviously was full takeover by the Bank for International Settlements. So it worked for FIC. And so both America and the West, they had no choice in this matter because they're all just being strategically portfolio managed. But this is effectively sovereign positioning. And this is why I bring it back to the individual level. You need to be sovereign. You need to protect, and that's been always my message. Your company needs to be sovereign. And you can see what happens when your country is sovereign. Get beyond the psyops. Communism versus capitalism. There are just resources, and there is degrees of controlling strategic choke points, and there is sovereign and or not sovereign, and everything else you can think of as a psyop. And so now let's go through, that was the China strategy. Let's look at the Iran strategy and the various other players. Let's take a quick break for an AI video, and we'll go through the Iran strategy.
No. He's buying an island of ice where the world is on fire. A billionaire liar, a professional prior. He tweets in the morning, NATO is useless, while leaving the youth in the street feeling rootless. Automatic draft, yeah, the art of the steal. Trading your life for a classified deal. Vietnam vibes, but the reason is trash. Protecting the files while he's burning the cash. Facts. The jungle's dead. Blood on the floor. The jungle's dead. Why are we going to war? The jungle's dead. Secrets in the file. The jungle's dead. Killing with a smile. The jungle's dead. The jungle's dead. The jungle's dead. The jungle's dead. 100 strikes, 10 minutes, it's insane. 50 buildings down, washing blood in the rain. They call it strategy, I call it a joke. 100 families vanishing in smoke. You call it the law, no, it's jungle survival. Killing the innocent for a political rival. Sky News is laughing, your own people hate you. And even the news starts to underestimate you. The straight is a chokehold, the vows are rule closed. The weakness of Washington is finally exposed. $98 and the price keeps on creeping, while the mothers of the drafted are bitterly weeping. You're thirsty for helium, you're thirsty for gas, but you're stuck in a war that is kicking your ass. It's the law of the jungle where the strong eat the small, but even the giant is bound to fall. Crash! Crash. Mess, I'ma warn you, the exit is gone. You're trapped in the darkness before the dawn. 1 out of 7, your own party is turning, while the bridges to Tehran are steadily burning. You're buying the ice to cool down the shame, but the Epstein files have your middle name. Automatic enrollment, automatic grave. Is this the freedom that you promised the brave? Tucker was shouting, get the weed from the Zion, but you're tied to the beast and you're feeding the lion. 50 towers, 100 explosions, building an empire on bloody erosions. You're the king of the jungle, but the trees are all bare. There's no loyalty left, and there's no one to care. The jungle's death is a heavy amount, and the blood of the children is the only count. The jungle's dead, blood on the floor. The jungle's dead. Why are we going to war? The jungle's dead. Secrets in the file. The jungle's dead. Killing with a smile. The jungle's dead. Blood on the floor. The jungle's dead. Why are we going to war? The jungle's dead. Secrets in the file. The jungle's dead. Killing with a smile. $98, 50 buildings, 100 strikes, and 0 ways out. But sir, what about Greenland? Forget it. The ice is melting anyway. The jungle's dead. Pay it in full. Impeach. Impeach.
Okay, so what was the Iran strategy? As I said, I've always described Iran as a economy within a country. And so you have the Iranian government, and then you have the IRGC, and then you have the supreme leader. The Iranian government has a democratic process, but is based upon who the supreme leader says, and it's enforced via the IRGC. And the IRGC has its own economy, which is banking, infrastructure, control of Strait of Hormuz, ports, various other things. And it also has the resistance economy. And the resistance economy was built, obviously, in reaction to the CIA and MI6 operations, started in 1953 with Operation Ajax, where they effectively overthrew the democracy and replaced it with the Shah. They used media, and they even had an oil blockade by the British Empire at the time as well. They used media to pretend that the democracy was killing people, exactly like we had leading up to this one. Then a currency war, and then you try to manufacture civil unrest, and then you installed the Shah so that British Petroleum could keep its 80% of Iran's oil. That then led to, the strategic tension later, the 1979 Iranian Revolution, that then led to the MIC profiting from the Iran-Iraq war, where they funded both sides. Iran-Contra, Jeffrey Epstein was connected to weapons trafficking. Iran ended up with weapons via Israel. Israel was working with the US, and then Iran was, trafficking weapons back to the Contras that was propping up the CIA drug trafficking operations within America that props up the deep state in this circle. Covered it many, many times. You can see that in previous videos. Anyway, and so you always had this strategic tension. There was an operation by the military-industrial complex to make sure the Middle East was always in carnage. It would fund Israel. Israel would always agitate wars. Israel and Iran would never go to war, but it would push a narrative that Iran is 2 weeks away from a nuke, and death to America, death to Israel. That led to trillions of dollars of money printing, the clean break memo, where it overthrew Sudan, Libya, Iraq, what else am I forgetting? Lebanon. And all of those had their own operations that are beyond the scope of what I'm covering today. Iran was the last one, but they never had the actual war until we had October the 7th, where there was very theatrical 12-day war and a tick for tack, and effectively the model of creating a humanitarian crisis in order to level Gaza, and now they're doing the same within various parts of Lebanon. Remember, Lebanon was a victim of the IMF. They destroyed the currency, confiscated all the savings. There was that massive explosion, which was a ginormous crisis, severe economic disaster. The CIA installed a US proxy government, and then Iran fought back by creating Hezbollah. And then in Yemen, you had Houthis. In Gaza, you had supporting Hamas that then switched when Iran was funding the military arm, but the political arm was funded via Qatar. Qatar is a US ally. US asked Qatar to have an office for Hamas within Qatar. And then there was always this strategic tension and resistance economy, as well as the war in Iraq that led to Iran gaining power. And then you had the destabilization of Syria, and all the different things. And I'm going to go into all of that. Covered it multiple times in detail. But effectively, from Iran's side, you had a new power called China. And Iran joined BRICS and then normalized with Saudi Arabia. And that Saudi Arabia, as working as a US proxy, but then them becoming independent with China energy and all the different things, the regime change, the assassinations, the 1973 oil embargo, Safari Club that led to 9/11 with Mossad, Saudi intelligence and CIA, all of those things that I've covered in previous episodes. They effectively, Iran ended up on a dual track, which is, in order to survive, the forever war model is coming to an end, and China will keep purchasing your oil. They'll purchase from the Gulf, and we'll have a golden age within the Middle East and turn it into West Asia. And so that meant that there were vested interests that were stuck on the old model. And the time for resistance was coming to an end. And Israel was no longer going to be funded by MIC, and it was repositioned. So that had to have regime change, as well as Iran, as well as the neocons in America. Because Americans were thinking, we're propping up the petrodollar still, we're kicking ass with a global hegemon. And that required supporting Israel, which was the agitator, which then meant that Iran was the justification for keep funding Israel because of the resistance. And we were stuck in that destabilization model. China broke the cycle. And so Iran went on a dual track. Basically, in private, I believe it was negotiating. And that was based upon China's negotiations, normalization agreements, and partnership with transnational capital in the financial industrial complex. On the other side, you had the public, which is continue to resist, which was effectively the justification for the military industrial complex. And so you had October the 7th as the resetting of the board, and you had to compensate. And so that's why, the terrorists at the military industrial complex, their infrastructure needed to be compensated and they needed a new war zone. That's what I've covered all along. So what did Iran do? Well, Iran had that dual strategy: resist publicly, negotiate privately. And I believed that that had been going on for years, and that there was already the managed transition away from resistance and integrating what was effectively a negotiation tool for removing sanctions that Iran held on to. And therefore, the need for resistance was a managed transition to either eliminate hardliners or integrate those that were still left into political systems and national armies. But you can't do that without, destroying effectively the vested interests in the higher level hardliners of IRGC. And so rather than doing that externally, we entered into the 12-day war, and what I thought would be another 12-day war, but was way more bigger, that we've been covering for the last 7 weeks, where effectively Iran would internally regime change by outsourcing it to Israel and America. China would agree to rebuild the infrastructure. The Gulf countries would take a hit that China and the Gulf countries would rebuild, and then they would get effectively governance over Lebanon, the Levant. There would be a Palestine, and there would be an Israel that's not there to eventually probably get to a one-state solution, because they will be economically weakened and turned into a pariah state, and more trade deals will stop happening with Israel. But there are factions of power left over that are not on board in Israel, in IRGC, and in America. So there was a weakening campaign. Narrative-wise, Tucker Carlson, Candace Owen, Nick Fuentes, all those people were destroying the brand of Zionism, but also manufacturing civil unrest by the previous ones that control media that were fighting against that and leading to removal of constitutional rights, freedom of speech, various other things. On the Israel side, there was the failure of October the 7th, which was allowed to happen. Look at my blog, Atrocity Inc. All the lies. There was no mass sexual violence, none of that. This was a military operation, hostage swap. And Netanyahu was meant to ethnically cleanse the Palestinians into Egypt, but Egypt aligned with GCC, who was backed by China, and didn't take them. So there was a strategic weakening of Israel, and now they're negotiating their technology, their Mossad, and various other things into other blocks like India and UAE. But effectively, this keeps internal stability possible. Because the worst thing that could happen is IRGC hardliners ends up in a massive external war, and then you have a vacuum like in Syria, and then you have all these different groups that are funded by external parties, and you set the whole region on fire. Most people thought that was going to happen. But I've always believed throughout this whole thing that Iran had a strategy, and it was in line with the GCC, and it was in line with the financial industrial complex, and it was in line within China and BRICS. And so this was why you needed theater to manage that transition. It's the most effective strategy when you take away the humanitarian crisis. Of course, there were people that would try and take that off plan by killing children in a school, which is the factions of Israel that are in the radicalist Zionist side, and also the American MIC and various other things. They want to profit as much as they can. But then Lebanon became the final part of that, because Hezbollah was the strongest resistance. Billions had been invested by Iran in weapons, financing, and is significantly stronger from a ground invasion perspective than the IDF and Israel. But from air dominance, Israel's stronger. So my belief was you set those off to destroy as much as you can while you go into a ceasefire process in order to try and get to an integration. And then that may fail, escalate, but nothing stops the train. Eventually, you get an integration of Hezbollah, decapitation campaigns, elimination campaigns, the strategic weakening of Israel, and a political diplomatic process. So this week, we had an announcement that there is a ceasefire in Lebanon. Whether it will hold or not, we shall see, but nothing stops the train, still the same. And it has entered into a political renegotiated process. So Lebanon, basically, the government asserts sovereignty, which is a US proxy that needs to be rebuilt into alignment with BRICS and the region and the GCC. And so remember, UAE is a member of BRICS too. Saudi is a supervising member. So Saudi was always the holdout. It was the holdout in the Abraham Accords. It was the holdout to say you have to have a Palestinian state. It was the one that was investing the most in Palestinian infrastructure, while Iran was funding resistance, while Qatar was funding the political process. UAE was normalizing with Israel, and they all played good cop, bad cop, but I think they were all aligned with that plan. You make Lebanon very, very weak so that it can have investment from the GCC and China, and you do the same across the GCC as well. You expel the US bases, you take out US infrastructure, everything's force majeured and renegotiated. And obviously, the FIC wanted a head start with all the oil sales in America. And Iran was compensated with higher oil sales, and China was prepared. They started releasing oil, and the same happened with the hedge infrastructure that the GCC built in Texas, America. But effectively, this breaks the proxy system and allows us to not have the justification for why Israel is always escalating. And so Hezbollah, as part of this, needs to be weakened or integrated. And I believe this was their mechanism for doing it. So then we had an Iran ceasefire that was tied to a Lebanon ceasefire. And so far, that's where we are right now. We will see how they roll out and what comes from it. But we then got the announcement that Iran's going to do a deal that no one told me that they would do. But this is effectively a symbol that the Iran pragmatists and the IRGC pragmatists have won. The regime change internally has effectively happened, and I believe it was an inside job with outsourcing help. We'll never get confirmation of that, but that's what makes sense to me. And so if this deal holds, it means the pragmatists have win. If it doesn't, then you'll get someone derailing the plan, which means you need to go back. You need to eliminate, do more decapitation campaigns, and then get to the next one. And that will continue until we're done. Hopefully we're done, because everyone dies. Those are real. That happens. So what is Israel's position now? Well, Israel basically is that every single player was playing the long-term game. GCC took a hit, and they'll be rewarded with new strategic alignments. Iran took the strategic hit. And Israel continued to try and function for MIC rather than adjusting to FIC and the regional stability plan. And so it was the only player that was focused on short-term survival, because Netanyahu had the genocide case in the international courts and the local corruption cases. And his Likud party he's the least extreme compared to Gvir and Smotrich, that were leaning into get as many Israeli settlements through state-sponsored terrorism and taking over the West Bank. Now, Trump had to satisfy that faction of power, which was his third largest backer, Miriam Edelstein. The FIC was his second largest backer, and the TIC was his first, Elon Musk and the Mellon banking family. But he had to satisfy Miriam Edelstein. So Affinity Partners was created, which is Jared Kushner, looking after the Trump family wealth, and it was funded by the Gulf countries in order to effectively bribe him and make sure that regional stability was profitable to Trump in order for behaving, and he gets to take credit and have the border peace and say that he won the Nobel Peace Prize and satisfy his Q-tards and MAGA-tards while they groom J.D. Vance for TIC. And effectively, the most people are horrified by Trump, but he gets all of this financial compensation out of executing this. So Israel was playing short-term politics all the way through. And the result is that it now has complete isolation. It now has the whole system recognizes globally how to configure without Israel. So this may actually end up in a one-state solution over time. And that was because of the short-term strategy. I think next we'll have the regime change and everything that follows after this. But I think Israel is either going to be controlled by the GCC or both Palestine and Israel is going to end up with a one-state solution over time because of the resistance within the West Bank. And so that is where we are. Now, most people think Israel's ruling the world. But the more land they conquer, the more they're able to negotiate for FIC. And FIC is managing the decline because MIC is going to get a war zone somewhere else. And so that's why Israel has to be regime changed. And if you thought that Israel rules the entire world, you would never have been able to get to this conclusion because it would have continued into the forever war. And so we shall see. We will only know that over the years ahead. But that's my thesis at the moment. So what I want to do right now is I want to share exactly who wins so that you can position yourself and we can test the theory moving forward and we can know how you can protect yourself as well. So let's take a quick break for another AI video and we'll go through who wins.
The chains are tightening. The key is turning. The gavel is coming down. Your fate is short. Baby on trial, the straight is the lock. Iran is the key. Hear the tick-tock. Baby in chains, the world is the court. Iran is the gavel, your fate is short. 360 million facing starvation because of one man's reckless escalation. Fertilizer prices up, the fields are dry, and America's missiles, watch them fly. Baby on trial, the straight is the lock. Iran is the key, hear the tick-tock. Baby in chains, the world is the court. Iran is the gavel, your fate is short. Washington Post wrote the truth today. 25% of missiles gone away. Pacific stockpiles empty and cold.
China is watching the story unfold.
You needed those rockets for Taiwan shore. Now they're in Iran and you want more. Atlantic magazine said it clear as glass. Iran decides the future now.
First class.
Baby on trial, the straight is the lock. Iran is the key, hear the tick-tock. Baby in chains, the world is the court. Iran is the gavel, your fate is short. $50 billion spent on the sand. Who's holding the car? Iran's right hand. You can pick JD Vance to take the fall, but Iran holds the pen. That says it all. The strait is closed for you and your friend. This is the moment.
This is the end.
You thought you could bomb, you thought you could hide, but the world is watching from every side. The chains are tightening.
The key is turning.
The gavel is falling.
The world is learning.
Baby on trial, the straight is the lock. Iran is the key, hear the tick-tock. Baby in chains, the world is the court. Iran is the gavel, your fate is short. Baby on trial, the straight is the lock. Iran is the key, hear the tick-tock. Baby in chains, the world is the court. Iran is the gavel, your fate is short. So baby,
The strait is still closed.
the key is still here.
The gavel is coming down.
Your fate is short. Baby on trial. 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 The straight is the lock. Iran is the key. Baby in chains. The world is the court. Iran is the gavel. Your fate is short.
Okay, so a couple more questions. Who wins and what comes next? Let's jump in with who wins. So people are talking about how the US wins. US is not corporations. They're not the same thing. The US, as an economy, as a people, get more debt, more inflation, higher stock prices, and a ginormous big print, because you have to bail out the companies that actually benefited from this, and you have to pay. And it's the asset holder that wins, which is concentrated in a fewer and fewer people. And so that's a continuation of the asset stripping operation. So which companies, I've already covered them in previous episode. But effectively, in the US, because it is corporate captured, it's the FIC that wins. And it's the public that pays. Now, with Russia and Iran, they're effectively have their own state energy. And so their compensation is that Russia is built on a war economy now after years of doing this. That will continue. But they got to finance ginormous amounts as a result of these higher energy prices, as did Iran. The Iranian numbers and the Russian numbers, when they get printed, when we see them, will be record in terms of state energy. Now, but they will have massive infrastructure rebuild projects. Not Russia, Ukraine obviously will, but Iran will have massive rebuild, and so will the Gulf countries. And so they get to realign. There is a cost to this for rebuilding that infrastructure. So China will make sure that all the supply chains are in line with China's interest. And they will provide any financing and Belt and Road Initiative by selling their treasuries, purchasing gold, purchasing energy, building alternative energy infrastructures, and rebuilding so that they have a future consumption market. Consume our goods. We'll also give you AI and robotics, and we'll tie together with the financial industrial complex so that the MIC can't take over our part of the world. You leave them to blow each other up. Now, the Gulf, even though they took significant hits, I discussed some of the different alternative investments and routes prior to this that were made up. And also at these higher prices, they are still meeting all of the demand based upon the demand destruction. So obviously there will be a recession as a result of this, and everyone will be impacted, and we need to get through those supply chains. But who wins from recessions? FIC, because that's where M&A and reconstruction contracts come from to purchase assets in distress. And so Gulf Capital will rebuild, and there will be a new order, and there will be lots of reconstruction contracts that will stimulate as well. So that's what you get when you really follow the money. Now, what did the market signal to us, which I covered throughout? Oil was always capped in the bounded escalation cycle with the 1 month future, $115, $150 maximum, because that was always controlled. And I always said, when COMEX came out and said, America, can you stop manipulating the oil market? They took a massive structural short position. And that would have been done via the FIC. And so the FIC would have made record fees throughout this process, as well as all the M&A activity. And they will go through stress, but the losses will be socialized and privatized as part of some kind of AI bailout or whatever, mechanism they create for the big print that we've always covered. In order to get there, you need fuel shortages. And fuel shortages are emerging. That will lead to distress situation, bankruptcies, concentration of power, and the FIC will get more and more power, more and more powerful. Insurance premiums will be higher. New routes outside of the Strait of Hormuz, there will be a premium based upon what happened. And so alternative routes across the Gulf and alternative pipelines and everything will be rebuilt. So the Hormuz will not return back to where it was, because everything's going to be more expensive as a result of that. That's the price that Iran will have to pay for the bits that it got. My guess is that the Hormuz, if there is a toll model, then it will be split across the different powers that are split at the table, and that will be BlackRock on the US side, or one of their portfolio companies, or the FIC in general anyway. And all the different connected parties will want to make sure this can never happen again. You'll get initial correction of yields, coming down on the 10-year and 30-year to try and get the mortgages down and the debt down in this distress. But then the real impact of pushing down short-term rates via the regime change at the Fed will make the 10-year rates and 30-year higher, which will cause massive distress. And so treasuries will continue to be sold, which will push up rates as a result of this, because this was a temporary measure to buy the oil purchased in dollars from America during this managed transition. The Suez and control will be negotiated. Effectively, we will be in a multipolar world. That is already done. The US, via the FIC, will vassalize the US, Europe, Americas, Central South America, and that will be the northern hemisphere that we've talked about. And it will be fully FIC controlled, and it will have surveillance police state by a TIC, and there'll be operations around the Russia theater with MIC. And so China will effectively now be the most important player in the Middle East, in Africa, and across Asia. And the FIC will try and penetrate that as much as possible by partnering with sovereign wealth funds as well. Now, the Gulf capital will effectively be the bridge between these two worlds, between US and China-led BRICS. And we're already seeing that because 40% of the Saudi ETF is financial services. We have BlackRock setting up their head office there. This is a realignment around alternative MIC-FICs and TICs in partnership with sovereign wealth funds and various other countries. Russia and Iran will be the energy provider in the region to China and the other Gulf countries as well. And there will be system splitting, and it will be effectively negotiated based upon the power dynamics of the outcome of the negotiation. And we'll find out what that looks like, and we'll be covering it in future episodes of Simon Dixon Hard Talk. But what is the trigger? I think you've got the ceasefire in Lebanon that may need more MIC escalation, but nothing stops this train. Iran may be another round. I think more likely that this isn't another round. I think there may be more in Lebanon with Hezbollah. That's a harder mission to achieve that integration. But the foundation will be set, and we'll get the same model of escalate to de-escalate, escalate to de-escalate, take land, and that leads to greater FIC negotiations. Nothing goes back to a MIC forever war in my perspective, which means no nukes, no World War III, bounded escalation. Because I think MIC has agreed, and they're already lining up their next moves as well. So that really just leaves what is the next thing you need to do? What are the things? How can you protect yourself? What's likely to happen? What is the likely deal? Let's take a quick break, and then we'll do the final section, and then we'll move over to part two with my interview that I did recently with Natalie Brunel.
Class is in session, lesson 1.
Wait, I have a note from Bibby.
He says we're the smartest kids in the class. We have a 10-day plan to win everything. It's brilliant, right, Professor?
Sit down, Donald, you're failing.
Sit down, Donald, you're failing. The Chinese media warned him. It's a trap for the blind. While the USS George Bush is creeping behind. 70 planes in a 10-day frame. Playing a stupid asymmetrical game. You're acting like a tough guy, a Bashies or rain clown. But the professor is ready to shut the class down. I'm not a clown, I'm the valedictorian of Chaos University. The Senate is voting. The leash is on your neck, while the Zionist gamble is turning to a wreck. How can a man with no history, no land, try to erase a civilization with a blood-stained hand? His history is boring.
I have a skyscraper with my name on it.
That's a civilization!
An artificial nation, a parasite's breath, trading a fake peace for a certain death. The professor is watching, the trap is already set, and the Zionist debt is a debt you can't offset. Playing checkers, but he's playing chess, creating a masterpiece out of your mess. Asymmetric God, the professor of the straight, while the Zionist puppet is sealing his fate. You offer a truce just to load up the gun, but the shadows are moving before you can run.
Wait, why is the shadow moving? I didn't give it permission. Stop it!
Pterodon is the brain, you're just a battery toy, a fake little Zarang.
A Zionist boy!
war, but you hide the count while the Zionist losses continue to mount. Fox News is shaking, the bluff has been called. The art of the deal is officially stalled. If Lebanon is burning, the peace is a lie. And the U.S. says George Bush is a sitting fly. You have no roots, you're just plastic and neon, trying to crush the spirit with a heart made of iron. The professor doesn't move until the trap is shut.
70 planes, 0 brain. The school is over.
You're a ghost in the desert, a blip on the screen. The strongest trap is the one that isn't seen. The jungle law is rising, the roots are in the deep, while the artificial empire is falling asleep.
$98, the straight is a wall. The bigger the bully, the harder the fall. You sold out your country for a Zionist dream, but you're drowning slowly in the professor's stream.
I'm a great swimmer. I have the best floaties.
Gold-plated floaty. The files are leaked, the soul is empty, while the toll booth of Hormuz is charging you plenty. Lesson over, you failed impeachment is your diploma.
Wait, can I do a retake? BB, tell him I'm smart.
Mark Rutte, call the principal. I still want Greenland. It's a witch. Impeached.
Impeach.
Okay, so as I've suspected all along, May the 14th, the China summit, the meeting between Xi Jinping and Trump is the key moment. It is the key deal. And this is what I think a likely deal looks like. Now, I'm not sure what they announce, what's PR, but here's what I think will actually follow. China is going to continue to purchase global and US energy. And maybe as part of the deal, they'll buy some of the US LNG. And that ties the two together in a world of multipolarity, but not to strengthen the dollar too much, to make sure that the Chinese yuan strengthens more than the dollar. And there'll be the right amounts of balance in order to weaken the dollar, strengthen the Chinese yuan, and get that balance right so that US can build a manufacturing regional base, and China is able to build its internal consumption economy, or push the AI and everything else we talked about. But there will be a balance, right? Think of it like a Plaza Accord. Steve Mnuchin called it a Mar-a-Lago Accord. But this really is in China, which resets the world order. The fact that Trump has to go to China to do this is optical. The fact that this major escalation leads to a deal means that China is framed as effectively a new diplomatic leader in the world. Now, US will continue to rely upon China industry because there's no way of changing that. But by weakening the currency, you can rebuild the manufacturing base and take away some of those dependencies. And maybe, there'll be whatever we need to do with Greenland and rare earths and all these different things that may take a decade to execute. But more independence in terms of those supply chains, and China will be supplying those supply chains in the global south and the new world order. But I think they're going to decouple over the next decade in terms of the complete dependency. And that is in line with what basically weakening the dollar, strengthening the Chinese yuan, and focusing on more internal consumption in China, and more manufacturing base within America as more of a nationalist thing, which means give up world reserve currency, which means everyone stops buying treasuries, which means that you need gold as world reserve asset, and settlements between countries in currency wars of multipolarity will be those sovereign individuals will want Bitcoin in self-custody as well. Energy is basically, it's almost like an energy for manufacturing swap that I think will be announced. The US dollar will be weaker, the renminbi, the RMB, and the CNY, which is the internal and external version of the Chinese currency, will be stronger. This was always a currency war. It always has been. It always will be. I've covered centuries of currency war history. This was no different. What happened in Iran was a currency war. What's happening in Turkey is a currency war. What happened between China and America was a currency war. US only has one way of fixing this. It needs to print money continue the K-shaped economy, and reinvest that into the private stock market. That's the only way to continue, which means the rich get richer and the poor get poorer. The only way to win and beat this is to own assets, because it's the asset class that win. It goes back to that. This was a ginormous wealth transfer, and the big print will be a big transfer. If you haven't watched my interview that I did on BTC Sessions with the author of the big print, Larry Lepard, you can check that out as well. That was last week on week 6 in part 2. But the debt forces it. The dollar is not being restructured. Even if you transition to stable coins, it's still a debt-based Ponzi scheme. I mean, the COVID was a $5 trillion big print. Maybe this is a $7 to $10 trillion big print. I expect the narrative that is needed is China's winning the AI race, and therefore we need to bail out the AI sector, and we need to create manufacturing bases to build out all the AI and robotics infrastructure. So nothing stops that train. And I think the big print will be a bailout for the Mick, Fick, and Tick. As always, financial institutions will concentrate power. Mick will get more budget for the other war theaters. And Tick will get the police and surveillance state. And it will be paid for by you. So that means an inflation and a reset. I think there'll be a short-term recession as a result of this reset. I don't think we're going to enter into a depression, because that was continue closing the strait. If there's some kind of long-term de-escalation towards that cycle, and it's not escalate to de-escalate, then my analysis is wrong. America will do a ground invasion, take over Iran, price oil in dollars. Israel will continue to be the hegemon, or will be a hegemon for the US military-industrial complex, and there'll be no Palestine. That's what will happen if I'm wrong here. But I think we're transitioning to this multipolarity. So let's go through the final conclusions so that people can start to think how to protect themselves, where do they want to live, how are they going to allocate their portfolios and everything. In summary, this was not about Iran. This was about energy. This was about supply chains. This was about finance, which is why those who are saying this is an ideological war, that's the narrative for the soldiers. But it's not for the leaders, and it's not who you're negotiating with. This was a managed transition and an alternative to World War III and potential nuclear war. While people are talking about how the GCC is over, there was a realignment within the GCC towards Saudi being the biggest winner within the GCC. And so who is going to lead the region? People think it's going to be Iran. I think it's going to be Saudi, and Iran will be a regional power, and they will be normalized, and they'll most likely do a pipeline from the GCC from Iran into the GCC to tie them together economically, and that will be done through rebuild and manufacturing contracts. And I think both the GCC and China and the financial industrial complex would have negotiated what those rebuild contracts look like in the Build Back Better model. Saudi Arabia will write the majority of the checks in the region. They have cooperated with the FIC. They were also the one that solved the energy crisis through their alternative pipelines. And they will most likely be the regional hegemon after a moment of everything that's happened. They will phase out the oil in order to manage the price. I think it will be higher energy prices from here as they manage the transition. They will control the capital flows. Saudi will be the go-between between the petro-yuan and the petrodollar as we manage this transition. They're going to be hosting many of the major capital markets. And the market is already pricing this. If you look at some of the ETFs and where capital is flowing, and Saudi ETF is approximately 40% financial services. It's kind of trading like a financial services bank in terms of an oil state. So Vision 2030. Tourism will return. It will take some time. There'll be a big hit that will require lots of reconstruction. But it will become a regional capital hub. The new system effectively will be Saudi capital in the Middle East, partnered with other sovereign wealth funds and BRICS capital. The UAE will form logistics, doing stable coins, technology, various other things. It will acquire as much of Israeli technology, AI, that type of stuff, but it will be part of that logistics. It provides an essential role in helping Iran circumvent the sanctions. Turkey and Egypt are effectively the military hubs. Pakistan will be the regional nuclear power and the umbrella integrated into the manufacturing base of Turkey. Turkey actually has the most strategic location. There'll be a regional hegemon. You'll have Iran, you'll have Saudi with the GCC bloc, and you'll have Turkey, and they'll be tied together via BRICS. Turkey is actually perfectly positioned between EU, the financial industrial complex in the West, and China and BRICS as well. Iran will be reintegrated. The IRGC will maintain all the bullshit narratives, all of the Lego videos that we've been watching. They've rebranded Iran away from thinking that it's some country beheading people, which was always ISIS, which was Israel and Western allies in terms of those militia operations. China's going to be the backbone manufacturing base, and it will rebuild strategically based upon how well Africa, the global south, Southeast Asia, Indonesia, Malaysia, Vietnam, Philippines, based upon how well they negotiate into this, they'll have a part of the manufacturing base as well as Turkey as well. I'd say the Middle East is going to become West Asia in terms of alignment. There'll still be some FIC. The US FIC will be a part of, the regional power, and it will ensure that the MIC doesn't take over and create that as well. Trump will get to call himself the peace. The Q-tards will think it was MAGA 5D chess. And FIC will negotiate with the sovereign wealth funds and China as we move into a framework, 30 days, 60 days, 90 days, 5 years, 10 years, milestones. I still hold out that there may be a one-state solution and some different operations that happen over there over the years, but nothing stops this train because I think Israel deviated too much into short-term strategy rather than regional integration. But we'll see based upon the regime change that will likely, I think, will be predicted to happen. And transnational capital rules the world. That is the world power. And you can follow the capital flows via ETFs and via investments in alternative mix and the global technical industrial complex, police and surveillance state. So what is the final protection for you and yourself? It's the same as what I've always been saying. Don't trust the system. No government's got your back. We're entering into a world where it all goes down to the community level. You've either got a sovereign country, which will be very authoritarian, or you've got a sovereign company, which means you can co-opt and work alongside FIC, or it will be sovereign and independent, a local business serving real needs, real capitalism, free trade, free markets, hard money. Or it will be you that will either be under one of those authoritarian regimes and police states, or you'll have self-custody to protect yourself. Self-custody of Bitcoin in the digital realm, self-custody of gold in the physical analog world, and you boycott the Federal Reserve System and make the FIC weaker by taking control of your own assets rather than giving it to them. You boycott the large asset managers by holding it in self-custody rather than custody. You boycott the banks by not borrowing against your Bitcoin and reducing your debt, reducing your usury exposure. You boycott the transnational institutions by investing local, spending local, boycotting wherever you can, be conscious of where you're spending your money, help your local community, build parallel systems, invest in parallel systems as well. Basically always follow the money. I'll continue to cover the different worlds, where I got it wrong, where I got it right. Please put in the comments whether you think I'm wrong, whether you think I'm right, how well you think this framework helps you. but always understand power dynamics and follow the money in order to understand that ideology is weaponized, but it's only when finance is combined with ideology that you get movement. And that's the reality. Remember when they were telling people to uprise against the IRGC? The only way a revolution works is when it's combined with military power. And so if you were involved in propaganda to make people uprise while the CIA implant, that Razi, the Shah's son, was just there to create theater, and you engaged in that propaganda and cheered it on, sadly, without knowing it, you inadvertently asked people to uprise against a military force. And revolutions only work when regional powers allow it to work, because money is what dictates those flows and whether that actually works. But there is a genuine revolution, and that is a financial revolution. Opt out, boycott. And if you want the system to go down, we may end up in an environment that breaks everything, which is people stop paying their rent and mortgages, because that is the system. And that is where it may go. And I want you to be prepared for that eventuality, because that's not a pretty world and it's not going to look good. You need to prepare where you're going to be if that happens. And you need to prepare what your finances look like. Big print, great takings. Who's the custodian? Sovereign is the name of the game. So I'll continue to develop sovereign strategies, diversification of passports, jurisdictional wealth not in the same country that you live in. The country that you live in is based upon their sovereignty. You know, what's their debt burdens? These types of things. It's a journey, no perfection. But the deaths were real throughout it. So don't think that this is humanity. We need to maintain our humanity, because they're trying to radicalize us. And the algorithms are trying to radicalize us because they want to manufacture consent for a police and surveillance state. And that requires a revolution. So the revolution is factored into the goal. They profit from the asset stripping. They profit from the revolution, and they hedge for every outcome. The FIC is getting more powerful, not less powerful. Understand, none of these politicians work for us. Don't allow yourself to fall in for that. Vote out, but with your money, not with your vote. Show them that record levels are not voting, so we defang the system. They don't have power. They don't know. We know who the real power is. The inflation was real. The deaths were real. The inflation will be real. The global reset was real. But this wasn't war. This was a managed theater. And that's the reality. This is the system that we've always been in. This is a restructuring, because they need to change the game, because the old game's no longer working. And so just by design, exactly as we hit this next stage, what does the FIC spokesperson, former Treasury Secretary Hank Paulson, come out and say, quote, "The US needs an emergency plan to react to a coming collapse in demand for US treasuries that will have vicious effects." They're prepping you. JD Vance is being groomed. Arachi was groomed. You know the truth. Very few people will. And most people will watch the TV and follow the media and listen to the politicians and continue the theater. You focus on you. You focus on your family. You focus on your community. And you focus on your spirit and your relationship with money.